Beneath our feet lies a silence that has lasted longer than memory, longer than the rise and fall of kingdoms, longer even than the reach of myth. It is the silence of forgotten ages, when the earth herself was young, and when our kind was only a fragile whisper against the roar of wind, fire, and stone. Yet from scattered bones, chipped flints, and ruins swallowed by oceans, voices still speak to us across that silence. They tell us of lives lived by firelight, of worlds swept away by flood and ice, and of builders who may have shaped wonders that defy our comprehension. We walk upon the dust of these vanished worlds every day, rarely pausing to feel its weight. But tonight, we pause. Tonight, we ask, did ancient builders harness powers we no longer understand? And if you find yourself drawn into these mysteries, let this journey not be yours alone. Share it with those who, like you, feel the pull of deep time. Leave your mark with a like, lend your voice in the comments, and join us by subscribing, so that the echoes of these forgotten worlds may never fade into silence again. The night presses in, vast and unbroken, a dome of shadow above a treeless horizon. Somewhere far beyond the circle of light, the grasslands whisper with hidden movement. Shapes low to the ground, padded feet against soil, the faint hiss of breath that does not belong to the gathered humans. But here, within the fragile halo of fire, there is a rhythm older than memory. Sparks rising to the stars, wood collapsing into embers, the soft murmur of voices woven together with the sound of the wind. Around this living core of flame, the first chapters of our story are written not in ink, but in warmth, smoke, and survival. They huddle close, their skins wrapped in pelts still heavy with the scent of musk and earth. Each figure bears the scars of their life, from the faint white marks across forearms where thorns tore, to the heavier gouges left by claws, stones, or desperate hunts that demanded too much. Yet the firelight makes them something more than survivors. It gives them a strange radiance, as if in its glow they are not merely creatures of flesh, but the beginnings of something greater, something that will one day alter the course of the world. In their eyes flickers the same reflection of flame that once danced in the eyes of countless ancestors, reaching back into ages before names or words. The plain itself is immense, stretching from the edge of the fire to where the stars dip into the horizon. Mammoth herds wander these expanses, leaving deep furrows in the earth where their great weight presses into damp ground. Lions stalk these herds, moving with a patience honed over centuries of ice and grass. Wolves, too, circle at the margins, their howls rising now and then above the wind, reminding the gathered humans that this land is not theirs alone. Every dawn begins with the possibility of a hunt and ends with the possibility of being hunted. Yet, in this constant cycle of peril and provision, there is also a rhythm of ordinary life. A woman shapes flint with careful taps of stone on stone, the sound sharp and precise, sending flakes scattering onto the soil. Each strike is an act of memory, passed from hand to hand, as knowledge embedded not in books, but in gestures, repetition, the patient endurance of craft. Beside her, a child plays with a fragment of bone, dragging its tip through dust to make meaningless lines, perhaps not meaningless at all, but the faint stirrings of imagination. Others carve meat from the day's kill, stringing it over the fire so its smoke drifts upward, carrying the scent far into the night. These are the moments in which humanity takes shape, not as an abstract word, but as a pattern of survival and kinship. Each firelit circle becomes both fortress and school, a boundary against predators, and an arena of teaching, where the very act of telling how to strike flint or how to read the wind is itself the laying of foundation stones for everything to come. What separates these figures from the beasts that circle beyond the light is not merely tool or language, but a growing sense that the world can be remembered and reshaped. Fire becomes more than heat. It becomes permanence. Listen closely, and you can almost hear their voices carried across the dark plain. The words themselves are long vanished, but their cadence lingers in the rhythms of lullabies and chants that echo in far later ages. The old ones tell stories not to amuse but to preserve, stories of hunts, of rivers that swelled too high and drowned camps, of spirits glimpsed in dreams that warned or promised. In the weaving of such tales lies the first architecture of culture, the beginnings of myth as a map through a dangerous world. Above them, the stars shine with a brilliance unknown to us who live in cities of artificial light. Constellations glimmer in their full sharpness, a pattern the people beneath them cannot yet name, but can surely feel. There is awe in their silence when eyes turn upward. Perhaps already they sense that the same fire burning in their circle burns also in the vault of the heavens. That recognition, that the sky is more than backdrop, that it too speaks, is among the oldest stirrings of wonder in the human soul. The land itself seems restless. Great glaciers, only a few days' march north, loom like frozen walls against the horizon. Their meltwater feeds rivers that cut new paths across the earth each season, flooding valleys, leaving behind lakes that last only a few generations before draining away again. To live in this time is to live in the presence of constant change, where the very map of the earth shifts under one's feet. For these people, memory is short but intense. They recall not centuries but seasons, not dynasties, but migrations that chase herds across thousands of miles. Theirs is a story inscribed in footprints and fading smoke trails rather than stone. Yet within this, impermanence lies a strange stability. Every band that gathers around firelight repeats the same rituals: the carving of meat, the passing of tools, the guarding of children, the telling of stories. Across continents, humans unknown to one another act in rhythms nearly identical, guided by the same needs, the same fears, the same sparks of imagination. There is a unity here invisible to them, but obvious to us looking back. The birth of a species that carries within itself the seeds of future civilizations. It is tempting to think of them as simple, as primitive shadows of what we are. But watch more closely, and the distinction begins to blur. Their eyes track the movement of animals with the same strategic patience as any modern hunter. Their hands shape stone with precision we might envy, each angle chosen with a craftsman's eye. Their songs, though lost, once carried emotion strong enough to soothe infants and steady warriors. To dismiss them as primitive is to miss the spark already alive in their gaze, the same spark that will one day build temples and cities, telescopes and ships. The plain on which they sit is not merely a hunting ground, it is a crucible. The fire cracks, sending a rush of sparks into the night. Children reach out to catch them as if they were stars descending, their laughter brief but vivid against the silence. An elder hushes them, listening. The wolves are closer now. Beyond the firelight, eyes glint, yellow against the dark. The band stiffens. Spears are gripped tighter, stones readied in hands. For a moment, the ancient balance hangs suspended, predator and prey, separated by flame. Then the wolves withdraw, the darkness swallowing them again, leaving only silence and the slow settling of ash. Sleep will come in turns. Some will watch, spears across their knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. Others will drift into dreams where memory and imagination blur, dreams of the hunt, of rivers, perhaps even of things unseen, dreams in which the boundary between the living and the mythic thins, as if the world itself whispers to them through sleep. These dreams, more than any tool, will shape the human journey, for within them lies the power to see not just what is, but what might be, to envision shapes in the stars, to remember hunts long past, to fear storms yet to arrive. And so, beneath the arch of the sky, the first chapter of our story unfolds. Fire burns against the darkness, fragile yet enduring. Around it, a handful of figures sit, unaware that their small acts of survival are the first strokes of a canvas that will stretch across millennia. They do not know they are ancestors. They do not know that one day their bones will be studied, their tools displayed in glass cases, their lives reconstructed in whispers and speculation. They know only that tonight is cold, that the fire must be fed, that the herd must be followed tomorrow, and that the stars, indifferent and eternal, watch from above. Yet in that simplicity lies the seed of everything. For though they vanish into the flow of ages, the fire they tend still burns within us. Every spark we kindle, every story we tell, every gaze we lift to the night sky is a continuation of that moment on the plain. And it is here, in this fragile circle of flame, that humanity begins not merely to live, but to become. Morning rises pale across the plain, a muted light that spreads through mist and smoke until the fire is little more than a smear of ash at the center of the camp. The air is sharp with cold, but already hands are moving, gathering tools, binding sinew, shaping the tasks that will decide whether hunger or strength rules the day. Stone lies at the heart of all of it, stone chipped into blades, stone shaped into points, stone ground against stone until a sharp edge glimmers like captured lightning. These fragments may seem crude, scattered relics of a forgotten people, yet in their geometry lies the first mathematics of survival, the quiet engineering of an age without names. One hunter kneels with a core of flint balanced on his thigh. The rhythm of his strikes is precise, each blow placed with a craftsman's certainty, though his vocabulary for what he does is no more than instinct trained by years of repetition. With each strike, flakes shear away, edges sharp enough to slice flesh or pierce hide. The tool takes form in his hands, an axe, a blade, a spear point. These are not mere weapons, but extensions of thought, proof that the human mind can see within a raw stone the potential for transformation. In these shards, we glimpse the first acts of imagination turned tangible, the first steps toward technology as we understand it. Nearby, bones tell their own story. A rib from a mammoth, hollowed and polished, becomes a flute that sings thin notes across the wind. The sound is raw, uncertain, more breath than melody, yet it carries something beyond utility. This is not a tool for the hunt or the hearth, but a bridge into feeling, into memory. It whispers of evenings when voices gathered not only to plan survival, but to weave something larger. A sense that life was more than meat and shelter, that echoes of song could bind a group as strongly as shared blood. Such instruments remind us that culture is as old as hunger, that beauty was born not in courts or temples, but in the wild silence of the Pleistocene. Symbols, too, begin to stir in the dust. A child presses a finger, blackened with ash, against the rock of a nearby cliff, leaving behind a handprint dark and unmistakable. Others follow, palm after palm, until the wall glows with the pattern of presence. They do not yet know that these marks will outlast them by tens of thousands of years, that their simple gesture of being will one day stun strangers who call themselves archaeologists. For them, it is only a moment, a ritual of belonging, a way to anchor themselves against the vastness of the world. Yet in that moment, humanity's first art begins. The declaration, "We were here." It is difficult for us, shaped by cities and written alphabets, to imagine the power of such marks. To these early people, memory is fragile, carried only in the stories of the old and the repetition of gestures. No archive exists, no scroll, no tablet. Death can silence an entire library of knowledge, and survival itself is a daily gamble. And yet, by shaping stone, by carving bone, by staining rock with ochre, they reach toward permanence. Each object becomes more than its material. It becomes memory incarnate. Imagine a cave where the walls shimmer with pigments drawn from crushed minerals, blood, and fire-blackened wood. Shapes of bison and deer run along the rock face, their forms pulsing in the glow of flickering torches. Hunters kneel before them, chanting, drawing spears through the air as if to pierce the painted hide. To us, these are artworks of staggering antiquity. To them, they may have been prayers, magic, or simply the joy of fixing the image of life in a place where it could not vanish with the morning. Whatever their purpose, they speak across millennia, whispering of minds already steeped in story and symbol. The memory carved into these walls is not factual in the way we think of records. It is mythic, emotional, carried by rhythm and image rather than detail. A painted deer does not describe a single hunt, but the essence of hunting itself. A spiraled line scratched into rock may stand for water, for the path of the sun, or for something now irretrievably lost. The ambiguity is not a flaw, but a feature. It allows the symbol to live, to shift its meaning with each generation, to remain relevant long after the specific events that inspired it are gone. In this way, myth becomes the first archive, and art becomes the first vessel for memory. But memory is not only carved into walls or shaped into tools. It is carried in bodies, in the way hands pass flint to children, in the way songs echo from one voice to another, in the way the dead are laid carefully in the earth. Graves appear in this time, sometimes shallow, sometimes lined with stones, often adorned with red ochre, beads, or fragments of tools. To bury is to remember, to say that this life was more than a carcass to be left for scavengers. It is the earliest acknowledgement of continuity, of ancestors whose presence does not vanish with breath. Each burial is both mourning and preservation, a recognition that memory stretches beyond the living moment. The interplay of stone, bone, and memory reveals a truth we often forget, that intelligence is not measured solely by invention, but by the capacity to remember and transmit. Every chipped blade, every ochre line, every buried body is an act of resistance against oblivion. They are small victories, fragile, but they accumulate, stacking one upon the other until they become the bedrock of culture. Without them, the flow of knowledge would be broken, and each generation would begin again from nothing. With them, the slow fire of continuity burns, carrying lessons across centuries. And what of the questions these artifacts pose to us? When archaeologists hold a flint blade, they see skill in the angles, but also mystery. Who first struck it? Was it shaped in haste for a sudden hunt, or in patience by firelight for teaching? When we hear the thin note of a bone flute played again after millennia of silence, do we hear joy, sorrow, ritual? We cannot know, and yet we are haunted by the echo. These objects are not mute. They challenge us to imagine lives beyond our reach, to fill silence with possibility. Stone, bone, and memory remind us too of our own impermanence. Just as we study their marks on rock, so one day our skyscrapers and satellites may be fragments to someone else. We are not immune to forgetting. What survives us will not be the full detail of our lives, but fragments, broken circuits, shards of glass, outlines of cities half buried by time. We too will be interpreted through the lenses of distant eyes, our motives guessed at from what little endures. In this, we are closer to the Paleolithic bands than we often admit. As the sun lifts higher, the people of the plain scatter from their camp. Some chase the herds, moving with the persistence of predators who know that distance, not speed, is their weapon. Others search riverbanks for flint, bending low to weigh each stone in their hands, hearing already the shape it might become. Children gather pigments from earth, their fingers stained red, yellow, black. In their gestures, the future is written. In their games, memory grows. And when night falls again, the fire will return, the stones will be sharpened, the flutes will sing, the ochre will stain rock, and stories will bind the circle together once more. Each repetition is not mere survival, but the layering of memory upon memory, until the past itself becomes a living companion. Thus, stone, bone, and memory weave themselves into a fabric that endures beyond the hunters who first shaped it. They are the threads from which culture emerges, fragile yet unbroken, whispering across the silence of ages that humanity was always more than flesh, that even in the earliest days, we carried within us the need to preserve, to remember, to mark the world so that the shadow of our presence would remain. Before the first word was etched into clay, before the first field was staked in the Neolithic, the earth spoke in languages of pressure and temperature, in the grinding syllables of stone against stone. Across the Pleistocene, ice advanced like a living continent, walls of compressed snow rising higher than cathedrals and stretching from horizon to horizon. It did not hurry. It did not rage. It moved with the patience of geology, a white beast breathing centuries, reshaping the world grain by grain. Under its weight, mountains bowed and valleys deepened. Rivers were dammed, rerouted, or born anew. The crust itself groaned, and entire coastlines retreated as water locked itself away in glittering vaults. To be human in such an age was to live at the margin of a force too vast to defeat and too steady to ignore, a force that cared nothing for hunger or song, and yet determined both. Listen to the sound of it, not the clean, chiming crack of winter in a city street, but a continuous undertone, muted and huge, the way a whale's heartbeat might sound if you pressed your ear to the ocean. The ice grinds rock to flour, drags boulders like toys, and leaves behind long, smooth scars on the bedrock, grooves that point like arrows to where the great sheets once flowed. The evidence is written everywhere the ice has passed. U-shaped valleys where rivers now wander weakly, moraines piled like the levees of leviathans, kettles and eskers and drumlins arranged in the quiet geometry of vanished glaciers. Even now, so long after the last retreat, landscapes bear that signature. And for those who walked beneath that sky, the signature was not academic. It was fate. Where the ice ended, meltwater began. In summer, whole continents listened to the roar of it. Rivers fat with glacial silt, cold and milky, slashing new paths across loose till. Lakes surged behind ice dams that held for centuries, and then, in a single day, failed with the ferocity of a collapsing wall. Such outburst floods carved canyons in a geologic instant, rolled boulders the size of huts, and scoured plains into braided channels that glittered like a tangle of silver threads. To follow the herds was to follow these moving edges of water, because where ice melted, grass grew. Where grass grew, the megafauna came. And where the megafauna came, humans followed, patient as weather. Mammoth and woolly rhinoceros, steppe bison and giant deer. These were the architects of human movement, as surely as the ice was the architect of land. Their migrations, tuned to the rhythm of melt and regrowth, pulled families across thousands of kilometers, from river to river, from valley to valley, through bottlenecks of ice-free corridors and over isthmuses that no longer exist. The world map then was a breathing thing. Sea level crouched tens of meters lower than it does today, and coasts ran farther outward. Shelves now drowned were once grassland and forest. In what would one day be the North Sea, the wind combed a broad expanse of dry land where people lit fires, tracked game, and told stories under skies that at night held familiar constellations and unfamiliar cold. One of those nights, imagine a hearth burning on that lost terrain, a place our age will eventually call Doggerland. The scent of salt blows in from a distant shoreline. The surf pounds somewhere over the low dunes. The air is fresh with sedge and thawed peat. Children sleep under pelts. Their parents whisper about herds spotted at dusk and about the hollow thunder of ice calving from a cliff far to the north. They have no word for continent, no word for glaciation, yet they understand what the earth is doing in the way that people understand the moods of a dangerous animal. The next day, they will pack the camp with quick hands because meltwater has eaten the bank again and the ground trembles when it shouldn't. They will move because movement is safety, and safety is the law. The ice did not only sculpt with subtraction, it also built. Along its margins, it raised ramparts of crushed stone and sand that would, long after retreat, cradle wetlands and forests. On the plains its breath made crisp, it laid down a mantling of loess, fine silt that wind carried for leagues and poured like smoke over the land. In ages to come, loess would nourish wheat, and wheat would nourish cities, and cities would dream up astronomies and alphabets. But for now, the silt whispered in drifts around exposed roots and pooled in hollows where foxes denned and hunters took shelter from the slicing wind. What we call the Holocene, the interval of relative warmth that cradles agriculture and history, was not yet secure. It hovered as possibility, and the ice, even in retreat, governed the borders of possible life. To live within that governance was to practice a cartography that updated itself with every dawn. Crevasses opened where the day before there had been crust. Rivers braided and unbraided like ropes pulled by invisible hands. What held steady were not the paths, but the patterns. North in late spring, south ahead of the first violent snows, east along the melt-fed streams when the herds turned there, west to the windbreak of the hills when storms rolled across the flats in black sheets. Knowledge was a lattice of remembered winters and careful observations, of tracks read at a glance and wines known by their taste. Elders taught it by naming and by silence, by pointing at the sky, and by letting a child's fingers trail across the striations left on a boulder. Here's the direction the ice walked. This is how you know. Now and then, the ice rode in fire. Volcanic ash settled on snowfields in thin gray veils, and when sun returned, the darkened surface absorbed heat, sinking into scalloped pits that multiplied like honeycomb. Far away, a caldera smudged the atmosphere, and winter sharpened for a span the length of an elder's story. Such telegraphy taught humans to think in chains of cause and effect too long for any one life. It trained a species to be historians before history, to count not only hunts and births, but seasons of thin grass and years when the sky itself seemed bruised. They learned to keep two scriptures at once, one in the bones of memory and one in the bones of the earth. The ice was not only a wall and a quenching, it was also a mirror. In the clarity of cold, sound carried farther. Stars seemed closer. Edges were more honest. The moral grammar of life simplified under such conditions. Waste, and you died. Pretend the river is safe when it is not, and you were taken. At the same time, generosity and foresight were not luxuries, but instruments. A share of meat reserved when bellies were already warm meant survival when the wind turned. A spare firebrand carried in a storm meant the difference between a night that held and a night that burned out in a fatal hiss. The ice did not reward cruelty or care. It rewarded what worked, and so what worked became the culture of those who lasted. From time to time, the earth lurched. The climate, which had been loosening like a fist, clenched again. Grass browned where it should have greened. Reindeer trails shifted. The listening quiet between gusts seemed to grow brittle. In later centuries, scientists would give one of these reversals a name and stitch together lines of evidence from lake beds and cave deposits and the chemistry of ancient ice to show how sudden the swing had been. But for those who lived the swing, there were only consequences. More careful rationing, longer migrations, a sharpening of the collective attention that could feel like fear and could, just as easily, feel like resolve. Place yourself now in a valley freshly released from its winter occupier. The glacier has crept back up the slope, and where its tongue lay last season, a lake shines, opaque with rock flour, cold as the inside of stone. On its shore lies a scatter of pebbles, too round and too foreign to have belonged to this valley before the ice introduced them. A human kneels and runs a hand through the shallows, and the water numbs bones and seizes tendons. He laughs at the shock because it makes him feel alive. Behind him, a woman of his band studies the cliff where streaks of different sediments ladder down. Old winters disclosed like pages. She reads them, though not in the way of later academics. She reads them as a hunter reads spoor, a record of passage, a map with no words. The chapter says the ice will come again. The chapter says there is time to move. In such places, permanence was not an expectation, but an error. Camps were woven from the materials of departure, bindings that could be untied with cold fingers, huts packed against the ground in forms that collapsed into sleds. Knowledge stored not in heavy objects, but in heads. Yet even within this mobility, the beginnings of attachment stirred. Some river bends became beloved for their fish. Some groves were spoken of as if they remembered you when you returned. Stones were stacked not only to hide caches of bone grease, but to mark that you had stood here, that your breath had thickened this air. And when the ice loosened farther and summers softened, those marks would be the faintest prelude to a different kind of mark entirely, because retreat, too, is a kind of creation. As the walls pulled back, corridors opened between ranges, and people walked them. As the seas rose, they ate at the edges of old hunting grounds, reshaping coasts into puzzles of marsh and headland where birds gathered in flocks like storms. On newly raw hills, the first soils were thin and easily wounded. Moss took hold, then grasses, then shrubs. Fire learned by humans from lightning's grammar ran eagerly through this newborn world, and with fire, landscapes could be edited. It was the beginning of a conversation between species and planet that would one day become a shout. For now, it was still a whisper. But it was there, a change in timbre when people moved through. And in that whisper lay the possibility of memory longer than a lifetime, memory pinned to place instead of to a single voice. Where the ice had planed a ridge into a smooth back, someone might return to find it gleaming and think not only of hunting, but of the stories told there last year. Where a glacier had left a balanced stone, children might give it a name and ask whether it watched. The discipline of reading land became the delight of remembering it, and the delight swelled into something rarer: reverence. The earth had shown itself capable of remaking everything. A proper response was humility. By the time the ice surrendered to what we now call the Holocene, humans carried with them a perfectly tuned instrument, a culture forged by constraint, a patience taught by distance, a habit of seeing patterns across seasons and generations. They had learned to survive not in spite of change, but because of it. And when the world softened, when forests thickened and rivers ran more reliably within their banks, when coastlines drew nearer to the shapes we know, that instrument would play new music. People would linger, they would tend, they would stack stones in circles and mounds, lift lintels, engrave spirals, and make the first architecture of awe. The ice did not end the story. It framed the stage on which the next act would unfold. In the clearings it left, a question grew as surely as birch and hazel. What if time could be folded into stone, not only worn into it by glaciers, but inscribed by human hands? What if the memory of a hunt, a season, a sky could be anchored in a pillar that would outlast the teller? Beneath the long shadow of the retreating sheets, as the last bergs bobbed away down newborn rivers and the last moraines settled into quiet hills, the first builders raised their eyes and considered the possibilities of memory made monumental. Somewhere ahead in that gaze waits a hill buried deliberately and a ring of carved pillars watching the morning star, works that will confuse us as much as they illuminate. The earth has done its shaping. Now the hands of the builders stir. Long before the first chronicles of kings and empires, before scribes bent over clay tablets or carved their words into stone, there were places that whispered of intention, vast rings of pillars, stones raised with purpose, walls buried beneath centuries of silence. To stand among them today is to feel the dissonance of time itself. We know that human hands shaped these sanctuaries, yet they seem too early, too ambitious, too inexplicable. They are not supposed to exist in the ages to which they belong, and so they unsettle the tidy narrative of civilization. They are shards of memory from an era we thought was illiterate, disorganized, incapable of monumental vision, and yet the evidence is immovable. Consider Göbekli Tepe, its carved pillars rising from a Turkish hillside that was deliberately buried thousands of years before the pyramids were even conceived. Its stones bear animals frozen in perpetual movement: foxes, vultures, lions, and creatures whose outlines are strange enough to provoke doubt. This is not the work of scattered bands still fumbling toward agriculture. It is something else, something more deliberate, and yet we cannot say what. Was it temple, gathering place, or a ritual map of the heavens? We find no village surrounding it, no trace of permanent settlement. The people who built it may have walked days to raise those stones, then vanished back into the wilderness, leaving their sanctuary behind like a riddle intended for us. Far across the oceans, in India's Gulf of Khambhat, sonar scans have revealed geometric patterns on the seabed, rectilinear shapes too regular to dismiss, now drowned under tens of meters of water. Scholars debate whether these are natural formations, artifacts of currents and tides, or the remnants of cities swallowed when the sea rose after the last ice age. If they are cities, they would be among the oldest ever known, their builders erased without record. If they are not, then they are still symbols of our hunger to find something older, deeper, a forgotten chapter hidden beneath the ocean's restless surface. What unites these ruins, scattered across continents and epochs, is the sense of misplacement. They do not fit. Their age seems wrong, their sophistication out of sequence, their presence a challenge to the clean staircase of history. We would prefer to believe that complexity came late, after millennia of slow progress. Yet here are stones that say otherwise, stones that suggest vision, planning, and an ability to organize labor on a scale we did not expect. If these places are exceptions, they are extraordinary ones. If they are not exceptions, then they may be hints of an entire chapter of humanity we scarcely glimpse. But we must tread carefully. The temptation to leap into fantasy is strong. Legends of Atlantis, Mu, and other lost lands have long colored our imaginations, and ruins like these seem to beckon towards such myths. Yet the archaeologist's task is restraint, the patient weighing of stone against context, of carbon against layer. Still, even the cautious admit there is mystery here. Why bury Göbekli Tepe? Why align megaliths with solstices centuries before agriculture spread? Why do flood myths appear in such abundance across cultures, echoing with uncanny similarity? Are these coincidences of storytelling, or are they faint recollections of something real, some catastrophe that erased more than landscapes? The shattered temples of forgotten builders do not answer. They remain stubbornly silent, broken fragments that resist our interpretations even as they invite them. Their very incompleteness makes them powerful. The toppled pillars, the drowned walls, the carvings weathered past recognition. These are not failures of history, but doorways into awe. They remind us that absence is as instructive as presence. Where we cannot explain, we must imagine, and where we imagine, we confront the limits of what we think we know. Walk through the jungles of Central America, where roots pry apart cyclopean blocks that once formed palaces now choked by green. Walk the deserts of Peru, where lines stretch straight and true across barren plains, visible only from the air. Walk the windswept coasts of Scotland, where circles of stone endure in mute defiance of centuries of storm. Each site is particular, bound to its culture and its soil, yet each shares a common rhythm, the need to lift stone, to order space, to carve into the fabric of the earth a sign that life was not merely transient. These are human fingerprints left at a scale that sought permanence. To the builders, these sanctuaries may have been more than places of gathering. They may have been clocks, charting the rhythm of sun and moon. They may have been altars, shaping the dialogue between the living and the dead. They may have been books without words, where each pillar or carving encoded a truth we no longer have the grammar to read. And perhaps, most hauntingly, they may have been memorials to something already lost even then. Reminders of floods survived, of worlds drowned, of ancestors swallowed by catastrophe. In their geometry, we may be seeing not beginnings but echoes. The earth itself seems to conspire in keeping these stories half hidden. The rising seas of the Holocene erased coastlines where people surely lived. The jungles of the tropics consumed whole cities, their walls pulled down not by war but by roots. The desert winds scoured inscriptions until only faint ghosts remained. What survives to us is not the fullness of what was, but the survivors of chance. The stones heavy enough, the carvings deep enough, the sites lucky enough to resist time. How much more lies beyond reach, crushed, drowned, or ground into anonymity? The record is not absence, it is fracture. And so we are left with this paradox. The shattered temples of forgotten builders are both evidence and enigma. They tell us that our ancestors were capable of astonishing vision long before we credit them with it, yet they refuse to tell us why. They confirm human ingenuity, yet they withhold human intention. In this silence, speculation thrives, and myth rushes in to fill the void. Perhaps that is their true legacy. Not the answers they provide, but the questions they insist we keep asking. As twilight falls over Göbekli Tepe, the carved foxes seem to move again in the shifting light, and the vultures spread their wings across stone that once drank in prayers. The site lies buried no longer, yet the purpose behind its burial remains beyond reach. Somewhere in the dust lies the memory of hands that raised those pillars, of voices that chanted among them, of eyes that looked upon the same stars we see tonight. And if those builders could speak, perhaps they would tell us that their works were never meant to be simple, that they were meant to outlast not only their makers, but also certainty itself. Thus the shattered temples endure, half ruin, half riddle, thresholds to a world where fact and myth blur. They remind us that history is not a staircase, but a labyrinth, and that in the silence of broken stone, we may glimpse not just what we have lost, but what we have yet to understand. Beneath the surface of every culture runs a current of story, a river older than kingdoms and deeper than any single generation. These stories are myths, narratives that blur the line between memory and imagination, that carry truths not in the precise language of history, but in the resonant cadences of poetry. To dismiss them as fantasy is to misunderstand their power. They are the first architecture of meaning, the scaffolding upon which societies built their understanding of life, death, and the cosmos. And across the globe, from jungled valleys to wind-bitten coasts, these myths are not only spoken or sung, they are carved, they are built, they are etched into the permanence of stone. Consider the flood, that most universal of human myths. From Mesopotamia's Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical tale of Noah, from the deluge stories of Mesoamerica to the flood legends of Aboriginal Australia, there is an uncanny repetition. The world is drowned, humanity nearly extinguished. Only a remnant survives. Scholars see in these tales echoes of rising seas at the end of the last ice age, when coastlines shifted hundreds of miles and whole landscapes slipped beneath the waves. Imagine a community watching their hunting grounds swallowed day by day, the waters advancing with a relentlessness that felt divine. Such trauma would not vanish. It would be retold, transfigured, amplified. In time, the memory of tides became the wrath of gods. And in stone, this myth found its sanctuary, carved into walls, encoded in temple reliefs, memorialized as both warning and remembrance. The stones of Egypt whisper of such weaving. Hieroglyphs speak of creation from chaos waters, of floods that threatened order, of gods who parted seas or subdued them. The temples of Mesopotamia rose as ziggurats, stairways to heaven, but also fortresses against the rising floodplain. In these monumental forms, myth and architecture entwined, towers as prayers of stone, myths as blueprints for survival. Were these simply symbols, or were they also cultural memories of a world that once seemed perpetually at risk of being unmade by water? The line is thin, and it shimmers when you stand beneath the weight of their masonry. Elsewhere, myths of giants ripple through stone circles and dolmens. In the windswept landscapes of Britain, legends claim that only beings larger than men could have raised the stones of Stonehenge. In Ireland, the passage tombs at Newgrange are said to be the work of the Tuatha De Danann, luminous ancestors endowed with supernatural might. Across the Atlantic, the Nahua and Maya spoke of earlier ages when colossal beings roamed, beings cast down in floods or fire. To modern archaeology, these are myths. To those who carved spirals into tomb walls and aligned stones with solstice light, they may have been sacred truth, encoded not only in story, but in architecture itself. What is striking is not the variety of these myths, but their resonance across distance. Cultures that never met spoke of floods, giants, golden ages, and divine architects. Some see coincidence. Others see the universality of human imagination, forever drawn to explain the unexplainable. And some whisper of shared memory, that we are hearing faintly harmonized echoes of catastrophes or marvels that once shook the world and seeded themselves in every tongue. The myths, woven into stone, endure not because they are fact, but because they carry an emotional truth, that humanity has always lived in the shadow of forces vast and unpredictable, forces that can be endured only if given story and form. At Göbekli Tepe, the carvings seem almost mythic in themselves. Pillars bear foxes that slink in perpetual motion, vultures that loom as if guardians of the threshold between life and death. Some scholars argue these reliefs may depict constellations, transforming the sanctuary into a mythic sky map. If true, then myth here is not just story. It is cosmology in stone, a weaving of narrative and starfire, a temple that retells the order of the universe itself. To walk among these pillars is to walk inside a myth, one whose meaning has slipped beyond our grasp, but whose power still pulses in the carved lines. Consider, too, the Nazca lines, etched across the Peruvian desert in forms that stretch for miles. Spiders, monkeys, birds, traced into the earth with such precision they can only be fully seen from above. Were they offerings to sky gods, pathways of ritual, calendars aligned with mythic cycles? Their silence refuses certainty, yet they embody the same impulse, to bind myth into earth, to make story permanent, to weave into soil and stone, a dialogue with forces beyond the human. Whether or not they summoned rain or fortune, they succeeded in summoning wonder, even now, across centuries of desert wind. We must also remember that myth was never merely entertainment. It was law, memory, and prophecy. To carve a myth into stone was to affirm it as the axis of a people's world. The flood myths warned of divine wrath and the fragility of existence. The myths of giants explained the presence of stones too heavy for ordinary hands. Myths of a golden age offered both nostalgia and warning that greatness can be lost, that pride leads to ruin, that humanity's place is always precarious. To dismiss these as primitive is to miss their precision. They were maps of meaning, guiding how communities lived, built, and hoped. Stone gave myth durability. What fire destroyed, what parchment withered, what memory forgot, stone endured. Spirals and tombs, solar alignments and megaliths, carved serpents winding along temple walls. These are mythic verses preserved against time. And yet even stone erodes. Meaning fades. We stand before them now and grasp only fragments. Were these serpents protectors, destroyers, or markers of rivers? Were these spirals suns, stars, or the very cycles of rebirth? We cannot know. The myth survives, but its translation is lost, and perhaps that is part of its design. Myths are not meant to be fixed, but to breathe, to change, to invite each generation into the act of interpretation. In the silence of these ruins, a paradox emerges. Myth woven into stone seeks permanence, yet its meaning is never permanent. It shifts with the teller, with the observer, with the age. What was once a sacred prayer may become a legend, then a curiosity, then a riddle. And yet through all these transformations, the myth endures, proving itself stronger than the mortar, deeper than the cracks. As dusk settles over a stone circle, or dawn spills into the passage of a tomb, one feels the strange continuity of this weaving. The stones do not speak, and yet they tell. They tell of a humanity that has always sought to anchor story against the tide of time, that has always felt the need to lift memory from the fragile medium of flesh into the endurance of rock. Myths woven into stone are both monuments and mirrors. They show us who our ancestors believed they were, and they ask us what myths we ourselves will leave behind. And so, as we move deeper into the labyrinth of forgotten ages, we carry with us this awareness. Myths are not decorations upon history, but its pulse. In stone, in story, in the resonance between them, we glimpse the profound truth that humanity has always lived not just in the world of matter, but in the world of meaning. The builders are gone, their voices dust, yet their myths endure, shimmering in stone, waiting for us to listen. There are moments in the long chronology of the planet when time itself seems to stutter, when the slow unfolding of seasons and centuries is interrupted by catastrophe. These are the resets of the earth, times when fire, ice, stone, or water rewrite the script of existence, sweeping away landscapes, species, and perhaps entire cultures. To live through such an age would be to stand at the threshold of erasure, to feel the ground pulled from beneath the feet of memory. We call them cataclysms, extinctions, climatic shocks. To those who endured them, they were endings. To us, they are riddles, because the traces they left may conceal not only the death of animals and forests, but also the loss of human knowledge too fragile to resist the tide. The Younger Dryas is one such riddle. Around 12,800 years ago, just as the world seemed to be thawing from the grip of the Ice Age, the climate lurched back into bitter cold. For over 1,000 years, glaciers advanced again, rivers froze, forests withered, and the warmth that had promised a new beginning vanished. The cause remains debated. Some argue for the sudden drainage of meltwater into the oceans, disrupting currents and dimming the sun's reach. Others whisper of an extraterrestrial impact, a comet that scarred the Earth and filled the skies with dust and fire. Whatever the trigger, the effect was brutal. Humanity's fragile foothold in farming faltered, and nomadic bands once again chased game through bleak and shifting landscapes. For cultures perched on the cusp of change, it was as if the hand of history had reached out and slammed shut the door of progress. In the stratigraphy of soil and ice, we can see the mark of this reset. Black mats of soot, sudden spikes in platinum, layers of dust that speak of skies darkened. And in myth, too, there may be an echo. Tales of sudden winter, of fire from heaven, of floods and famines that scour the earth, all may be remembered fragments of the Younger Dryas. If cities or settlements did rise before this chill, if sanctuaries like Göbekli Tepe were already part of a broader pattern of culture, how many of them were swept away by the return of cold? How many stories vanished with them? Resets need not come from the sky. The earth itself has always been capable of betrayal. Consider the volcanic winters, moments when the planet's own breath veils the sun. 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba in Indonesia erupted with such force that the world darkened for years. Ash blanketed continents, and sunlight dwindled. Crops could not grow, forests shrank, animals died. Some scientists suggest humanity itself teetered on the edge of extinction, reduced to a mere few thousand individuals. If true, then every one of us descends from survivors of that shadowed winter, heirs to resilience forged in hunger and smoke. Later eruptions, Tambora in 1815 for instance, offer us glimpses of what such winters mean. After Tambora, snow fell in midsummer, crops failed across continents, and famine stalked Europe and Asia. Multiply that by 100, and you can imagine the reach of Toba. These resets are not gentle, they are not gradual, they are abrupt endings, tests of endurance so severe that memory of them is burned into myth. The sun was swallowed, say the stories. The sky turned to ash. Such phrases echo across traditions, perhaps not as metaphor, but as living recollections of years when the world itself seemed to close its eyes. Water, too, is an agent of erasure. As the last ice age ended, seas rose more than 100 meters, drowning entire landscapes. Coastlines retreated inland by miles, swallowing the settlements and hunting grounds of generations. Doggerland, once stretching between Britain and Europe, vanished beneath the waves, its rivers and hills now silence beneath the North Sea. Along the coasts of India, Japan, and the Americas, archaeologists find hints of submerged structures, stone shapes that could be natural or could be the bones of drowned habitations. Each discovery raises the question: how much of early human culture was lost not to war or neglect, but to the simple, relentless rising of the seas? Flood myths are abundant, not because water is poetic, but because water is merciless. The memory of its advance is seared into story because it transformed the world itself. Imagine watching the ocean creep over a generation's work, the places of burial, the sacred sites, the hearths. Imagine being forced inland again and again until memory of where you once lived becomes legend. Over centuries, that legend hardens into myth, told as a story of gods punishing arrogance or cleansing the world. The reset becomes not only a geological fact, but a cultural scar. Fire from the heavens has also rewritten history. The Tunguska event in 1908 flattened forests across Siberia, sparing humanity only by chance of geography. Had such a meteor burst over a city, the story of the 20th century might have begun very differently. Yet Tunguska was only a whisper of what larger impacts have wrought. 66 million years ago, the Chicxulub impact erased the dinosaurs and remade the biosphere. Humanity did not exist then, but to believe we are exempt is folly. Smaller impacts must have struck during the span of our own story. Some leave craters we can measure. Others may have left only fires, floods, and forgotten myths of gods hurling flame. Did one such strike trigger the Younger Dryas? The evidence is ambiguous, but the possibility reminds us how precarious the stage of history really is. Resets are not always sudden explosions. Sometimes they are slower, subtler shifts that nonetheless erase. Desertification swallows fertile plains, turning green valleys into arid expanses. The Sahara itself was once lush, dotted with lakes and grasslands where giraffes and crocodiles thrived. As the rains retreated, the desert advanced, driving people to the Nile and elsewhere. Rock art remains, testifying to a time when hunters cast spears at hippos, where now only sand burns. The reset here was not a single day or year, but centuries of change that gradually forced cultures to collapse, adapt, or move. Yet in myth, even these slow catastrophes are remembered as divine judgment or exile, because to those who endured them, the loss of abundance felt like expulsion from paradise. When we speak of resets, we are also speaking of memory's fragility, What is remembered after catastrophe is rarely detail. It is impression, terror, awe. The sky darkened, the waters rose, the earth shook, the people vanished. These fragments survive in story because they carry emotion. They are easy to transmit, easy to reshape, easy to integrate into ritual. The practical details, the year's weather patterns, the strategies of survival, are lost. What remains is myth, and myth becomes the only trace of real events too devastating to otherwise preserve. There is a humility in acknowledging this. We like to believe that our civilization, with its satellites and archives, is immune to forgetting. But the resets remind us that forgetting is the rule, not the exception. A fire large enough, a flood high enough, a winter long enough, and our libraries would be as fragile as ochre on cave walls. What would survive of us? What myths would our descendants tell, if any survived to tell them? Perhaps they would speak of a time when the sky grew angry, when towers fell, when the seas claimed the coasts. They would not speak of circuits and codes. They would not know the detail. They would remember only the awe. As we trace these resets in the geological and mythic record, one question shadows every step. Did they also erase cultures we have no trace of? If the earth has reset itself many times, is it possible that civilizations rose before and were swept away so completely that only faint echoes remain? Mainstream archaeology resists this speculation, yet even it concedes how incomplete the record is. The seas conceal much, erosion more, and what we do find is only what survived by chance. The possibility remains that the story of humanity is not linear, but punctuated, that what we call beginnings may in fact be returns after erasure. The resets of the earth are not merely history, they are prophecy. They remind us that the ground beneath us is never fixed, that stability is temporary, that the world can and will change again. To walk among the ruins of cultures buried in ash or drowned beneath waves is to see our own reflection. Their fragility is our fragility. Their loss is our warning. And yet within that warning, there is also resilience. Humanity has endured every reset so far, carried forward by memory, story, and the stubborn will to begin again. And so, when we look at the layers of soot in ice cores, or the drowned valleys beneath the sea, we are not only reading the past, we are glimpsing the shape of the future, for the earth will reset again. The question is not if, but when, and what of us and our myths will endure. When night falls far from the glare of cities, the heavens reveal themselves with a clarity that is almost overwhelming. The Milky Way arches in a river of fire. Constellations sharpen until they seem etched into crystal, and meteors stitch brief lines across the void. For the ancestors who looked up from plains, deserts, and jungles, this was not mere scenery, it was presence. The stars were not silent pinpricks of light, but actors, storytellers, navigators, gods. To gaze upon them was to enter into dialogue with eternity, to seek meaning in patterns that transcended the span of a single life. And in stone, in bone, and in myth, those gazes were preserved so that even now the stars remember. Consider the alignments of ancient monuments. At Stonehenge, the great trilithons frame the solstice sunrise, marking the longest and shortest days of the year. At Newgrange in Ireland, a shaft of dawn light enters the tomb's passage only during the winter solstice, flooding the inner chamber for a few moments before withdrawing for another year. In the temples of Egypt, the axis of Karnak aligns with the midsummer sunrise. In the Andean highlands, stones track the rising of the Pleiades, whose appearance in the sky foretold rains. These are not accidents of architecture. They are deliberate acts of memory, inscriptions of the sky into earth, calendars written not with ink, but with shadow and light. What compelled such precision? To mark the solstices is to measure time on a scale beyond the immediate. It is to understand that the year itself has a rhythm, that the world breathes in long inhalations of light and dark. By embedding that rhythm in stone, the builders ensured that their descendants would remember what they had learned. These alignments are not merely astronomical. They are cultural anchors, rituals and architecture that tied human communities to the cosmos. Each returning solstice confirmed not only the turning of the heavens, but the continuity of tradition. The stars remembered, and so did the people. Yet the sky was more than a clock. It was a canvas upon which myth unfurled. Constellations are stories mapped onto the heavens, narratives that gave shape to the chaos of stars. To the Greeks, Orion hunted eternally, chased by Scorpius across the celestial dome. To the Egyptians, Orion was Osiris, the god of resurrection, striding the heavens beside Isis in the form of Sirius. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples saw not only the stars, but the dark spaces between them. The silhouette of an emu traced in the dark dust lanes of the Milky Way, its seasonal rising signaling when to gather eggs. In every culture, the stars became mirrors of earthly life, guides for action, guardians of memory. Sometimes the correspondence went deeper, hinting at knowledge we have only recently begun to confirm. The Great Pyramids of Giza, for instance, are thought by some scholars to echo the arrangement of Orion's belt. Their shafts point toward significant stars, linking the pharaoh's tombs with celestial eternity. At Nabta Playa in the Nubian desert, megalithic circles erected more than 6,000 years ago align with Sirius and Orion, marking not only solstices, but the rising of stars critical to the agricultural cycle. Such sites suggest that humanity's earliest builders were also sky watchers, encoding not only myth, but science into their sanctuaries. The heavens were the first laboratory, the first scripture, the first calendar. Why this obsession with the sky? Perhaps because it is the only permanence we could trust. Rivers shifted, forests burned, glaciers advanced and retreated, seas rose and swallowed coasts. But the stars, though they too change, offered a stability measured across lifetimes. To watch the rising of a star in the same place as your grandfather did was to experience continuity, to feel that the cosmos itself bore witness to your lineage. And yet, even in their permanence, the stars hinted at impermanence. Precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, meant that over centuries the stars shifted. What once rose at the solstice would drift. Did ancient sky watchers notice? At sites like Nabta Playa and the Mayan observatories, there is evidence they did. To measure such shifts is to glimpse deep time, to understand that even the heavens evolve. The stars remember, but they also forget. In myths of the sky, we may find encoded memories of catastrophe as well. The Pleiades, that small cluster of stars, are nearly universal in myth. Often, they are sisters, pursued or protected, associated with both fertility and loss. Some scholars suggest this widespread focus may stem from an event witnessed by early humans, a time when one of the cluster's stars grew faint, altering its appearance. The story of a lost sister recurs across cultures, perhaps preserving a genuine astronomical change that occurred within the span of oral memory. If true, then myth becomes astronomy, and the stars are revealed as both participants in human story and keepers of it. Imagine an ancient night when a band gathers on a ridge. The fire burns low, the hunt is over, and attention shifts upward. Fingers trace constellations in the sky. Stories spill from elders' lips. Children listen with wide eyes. Above, the Milky Way stretches, luminous and incomprehensible, yet made comprehensible by story. To those gathered, the sky is not empty. It is inhabited by ancestors, spirits, gods, animals, all alive in the wheeling constellations. Each night is an act of remembrance, a rehearsal of the cosmos as a story that links earth and heaven. In this way, the stars themselves become characters in humanity's unfolding epic. Archaeologists find evidence of this dialogue in the most unexpected places. Cave paintings that resemble star maps, carvings that may represent eclipses, petroglyphs that mirror supernova remnants visible at the time of their creation. One of the most haunting examples may be the Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, where the ancestral Puebloans carved a spiral beside a depiction of a starburst. Scholars believe it marks the supernova of 1054, an explosion so bright it lit the day for weeks. Imagine the awe, the terror, the sense of cosmic upheaval. To carve it into stone was to ensure it would not be forgotten, to testify that the heavens, too, could rupture. What is striking is how often these sky memories intertwine with myth. A comet becomes a dragon. An eclipse becomes a battle between gods. A supernova becomes the birth of a deity. These are not errors, but translations, ways of binding incomprehensible events into the fabric of culture. Through story, the stars remembered not only their own motions, but the moments when they shocked humanity into new awareness. And in stone, those translations endured, allowing us to glimpse, faintly, what it felt like to stand beneath a sky that suddenly betrayed expectation. For us, with telescopes and satellites, the sky has been stripped of its intimacy. We know the stars are suns, the Milky Way a galaxy, the universe vast beyond measure. Yet even now, when we leave the cities and stare upward, a primal awe stirs. We feel what our ancestors felt, that the sky is not merely distance but presence, that the stars remember us even as we gaze at them. The constellations may no longer rule our agriculture or our ritual calendars, but they still inspire story, song, and science alike. The dialogue continues, even if the language has shifted. And perhaps that is the lesson of this chapter of humanity's story. The stars do not need us. They burn and die indifferent to our gaze. Yet by looking upward, by embedding their rhythms into stone and story, we have made them part of our continuity. They are our first teachers of time, our first mirrors of myth, our first intimations of infinity. They remind us that we are small, yes, but also that we belong to something vast, something that endures beyond ice, flood, or fire. In that endurance, there is comfort. In that impermanence, there is humility. So when we say the stars remember, we mean two things. We mean that in their alignments and their myths, they preserve the memory of those who watched before us. And we mean that when we too are gone, they will still shine, carrying silently the story of our gaze, our wonder, our attempt to anchor meaning in the endless night. The builders raised their stones to frame the heavens, and in doing so, they reminded us that though the earth resets, the stars endure, and in their endurance, so too does memory. Stand at the edge of any coastline, and you will hear it, the voice of the ocean, endless and indifferent, whispering against stone and sand. The sea is not merely water, it is memory. It has risen and fallen with the breathing of the earth, swallowing continents, revealing land bridges, drowning valleys, and erasing histories. The waves are archivists of a kind, though their method is brutal. They keep by concealment, by burial. They take whole landscapes into silence and hold them beneath salt and pressure. And within that silence lies one of humanity's most tantalizing mysteries. What worlds, what stories, what civilizations were drowned when the seas rose, leaving only faint echoes beneath the oceans? At the end of the last ice age, as glaciers retreated and meltwater poured into the seas, global coastlines shifted with astonishing speed. What had been fertile plains became seabeds. What had been villages and hunting grounds became reefs and shoals. Sea level rose over 100 meters in less than 10 millennia, an eye blink in geological time, but long enough to erase the evidence of entire ways of life. When we look at the ocean today, we rarely remember that vast tracts of it were once land. The North Sea, for instance, was once a green expanse called Doggerland, home to rivers, forests, and human communities. Its bones, antlers, tools, even skulls, still surface in fishing nets, reminders that what is now a storm-tossed sea was once alive with firelight and song. Doggerland is not unique. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kambat, sonar scans have revealed geometric forms suggestive of structures now drowned beneath silt. Some interpret them as natural, the product of currents. Others argue they may be the foundations of settlements older than known cities, swallowed by the Holocene seas. Along the Japanese coast, at Yonaguni, terraces of stone step down into the blue depths. Their sharp angles suggest human shaping, though skeptics call them geological accidents. The debate itself reveals our hunger. We want to believe that beneath the waves lies a lost chapter of humanity, civilizations forgotten, not because they were primitive, but because they were drowned. The oceans are deceptive in their silence. Beneath their surface lies a record of shifting climates and human migration. Consider Beringia, the land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska. It was not merely a corridor, but a vast landscape, rich in game, where people may have lingered for generations before moving south into the Americas. When the seas rose, Beringia vanished, taking with it whatever settlements or sanctuaries may have stood there. We remember its existence through genetic traces in populations and through geological evidence, but its human story, its hearths, its myths, its rituals, is sealed beneath the waves. The echo is faint, but it calls to us, insisting that the sea's silence is not emptiness, but concealment. In myth, these drownings become floods of divine wrath or cosmic reset. Atlantis, the most famous of lost lands, is remembered through Plato as a civilization swallowed by the sea in a single night of disaster. Whether Atlantis was allegory or memory, the archetype is clear. The ocean as destroyer, the sea as grave of worlds. Yet Atlantis is only one of countless flood myths. The Maori tell of lands devoured by the ocean. The Celts speak of sunken kingdoms whose bells can still be heard tolling beneath the waves. In India, Vishnu's avatar warns of rising waters. In each story, the sea is both literal and symbolic, both element and omen. The myths are not only metaphors, they may be cultural memory of landscapes truly drowned, communities truly lost. But can we recover them? The task is daunting. The ocean erodes and buries, and its depths are hostile to excavation. Yet technology begins to pry open its secrets. Submerged landscapes have been mapped in the North Sea, complete with ancient riverbeds and hills. Archaeologists have retrieved worked flint and hunting tools from beneath waters that have not seen sunlight for thousands of years. In the Black Sea, the flooding that followed the last glacial retreat left behind submerged coastlines, preserved beneath layers of anoxic silt, a time capsule that may yet yield evidence of human settlement. Each discovery suggests that the drowned world is not myth alone, but tangible, if elusive. Imagine what it would mean to uncover not just tools or bones, but structures, sanctuaries, perhaps even temples beneath the waves. It would confirm that human ingenuity reached farther, earlier, than we knew. It would suggest that civilization itself is not the product of a single cradle, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus, but a rhythm, rising and falling, appearing and vanishing, some episodes preserved on land, others drowned. Such a revelation would demand humility, for if civilizations have been erased once, they can be erased again. Our own cities, clinging to coastlines, are no less vulnerable than those that vanished beneath the Holocene seas. The sea does not only conceal, it also preserves in fragments. On the seafloor, shipwrecks endure as frozen moments of history, and in the shallows, peat bogs protect the remains of forests drowned when tides advanced. In these traces, we see the echoes of a broader truth. The ocean is not barren, but an archive, one we have only begun to read. The drowned forests of Doggerland still hold pollen grains that tell of the trees that once grew there. Sediments carry isotopic signatures of floods and droughts. Even fish bones, caught in nets and dated, whisper of diets and migrations long past. Every fragment is an echo, a reminder that the sea remembers even when it seems to forget. And yet, the ocean's memory is fragile, vulnerable to time and current. Each year that passes makes recovery harder. Each storm scatters what remains. In that sense, the drowned world is like myth itself, half remembered, half erased, preserved not in clarity, but in suggestion. Myths of floods, legends of sunken kingdoms, stories of gods who drew the line between land and sea. These may be the only way memory survived when the waters rose. They are echoes translated into story so that generations could carry them forward without needing the stones or bones that the ocean had claimed. As we listen to these echoes, we must ask, what else lies hidden? Entire continents once stood where now only ocean stretches. Zealandia, mostly submerged, is evidence that land can vanish almost completely. Could cultures have thrived on such lands before the sea claimed them? We cannot prove it, but the possibility lingers, haunting us. The ocean's silence is not proof of absence. It is only proof of concealment. Until we have searched every depth, the question remains open, and in that openness lies awe. The ocean is not only a destroyer, it is also a womb. It nourished life before land existed, and it continues to shape climates, currents, and migrations. For humanity, it has always been paradox, path and prison, food and famine, sanctuary and grave. The echoes beneath it are part of that paradox, reminders that the sea gives and takes with equal indifference. To live at its edge has always been to risk memory itself, to gamble that the ocean will allow your stories to remain. Now, as seas rise again with the warming of the modern world, we are confronted with the same truth our ancestors faced. The ocean is patient, but it is not still. Cities stand where Doggerland once stood, and they too may one day be myths. In that possibility, the past and future fold together. We are not exempt from the silence beneath the waves. We are merely another layer in its archive. And so, when we listen for echoes beneath the oceans, we are listening not only for lost worlds, but for warnings. The drowned landscapes of the past are mirrors held up to our present, whispering that permanence is an illusion, that memory can be swallowed, that story must be carried carefully if it is to survive the tide. The oceans remember, but they remember by erasure. It is up to us to hear their echoes and to weave them into our own story before they vanish forever. When we tell the story of humanity, We often imagine it as solitary, a species alone, walking its long path from campfires to cities, from stone blades to steel. Yet this is a distortion born of hindsight. For most of our journey, we were not alone. Across the shifting landscapes of the Pleistocene, others walked beside us, close enough to touch, close enough to love, close enough to fight, close enough to vanish. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in the mountains of Siberia and beyond, mysterious shadows like Homo floresiensis in Indonesia or the red deer cave people of China. These were not strangers. They were kin. And though they are gone, their echoes live within us, reminding us that the human story is not a single thread, but a braided rope, frayed in places, severed in others, yet still intertwined. The Neanderthals were the first of these forgotten companions to be rediscovered, their bones emerging from caves in the 19th century, misread at first as brutish anomalies. For decades they were caricatured as dim and primitive, a foil against which modern humans could shine. But as evidence accumulates, the caricature dissolves. Neanderthals shaped tools with precision, hunted with strategy, wore ornaments, buried their dead, and perhaps even made art. In the caves of Spain, hand stencils and red ochre markings may belong to them, suggesting that symbolic expression was not unique to us. They were not failed humans. They were another version of humanity, robust and intelligent, shaped by the cold steppes and forests of the Ice Age. Then came the Denisovans, known at first only from a fragment of fingerbone in Siberia's Denisova cave. From that fragment, sequenced with modern technology, came a revelation. Here was a lineage distinct from both us and Neanderthals, one that contributed genes to modern populations across Asia and Oceania. Denisovans left little in the way of tools or art that we can securely identify, but their genetic legacy is undeniable. In Tibetans, a Denisovan gene variant helps with life at high altitude, enhancing oxygen use in thin air. It is a reminder that the companions we lost still breathe within us, their adaptations folded into our blood. And there were others. On the island of Flores, skeletons of small-bodied humans, Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits, stood barely over a meter tall. Their tools suggest intelligence, yet their size and anatomy set them apart, as if the island had preserved a different experiment in humanity. In the Philippines, Homo luzonensis adds another branch to the family tree, discovered only in recent years. Each new find complicates the picture, revealing that our world was once shared by a chorus of human forms, each adapted to their landscapes, each carrying stories now silenced. What happened to them? The answers are as fragmented as the fossils. Climate shifts pressed hard against all populations. Glaciers advanced and retreated, forests turned to tundra, coastlines shifted. In such volatility, survival demanded flexibility, and it may be that our species, Homo sapiens, proved more versatile, more able to adapt. But coexistence was not purely competition. We interbred with our companions, leaving traces in our genomes. In some valleys, Neanderthals and modern humans shared tools, perhaps shared hearths. In others, the relationship may have been hostile. We do not know whether the last Neanderthal looked upon us with kinship or fear, whether their end was violence, assimilation, or slow starvation. What we do know is that by 30,000 years ago, they were gone, and we remained. And yet, not entirely gone. In every person of non-African descent today, about 1 to 2% of DNA is Neanderthal. In populations of Oceania, as much as 5% of Denisovan DNA persists. These are not trivial fragments. They influence our skin, our immune systems, our capacity to thrive in certain environments. We are hybrids of survival, our species not a pure lineage, but a tapestry woven with the threads of others. When we speak of forgotten companions, we must remember that they are forgotten only in body, not entirely in blood. But blood is not story. Genes do not carry myths, art, or memory. For that, we must imagine. Did Neanderthals tell stories by firelight, weaving constellations into shapes of gods or beasts? Did Denisovans sing? Did Homo floresiensis have rituals, small ceremonies binding them to their island and its spirits? These questions cannot be answered by bones alone. And yet, in our myths, there are strange hints. Across cultures, tales endure of little people who once lived in forests or mountains, now vanished. Folklore in Europe speaks of wild men, hairy and strong, lurking in the woods. Are these merely inventions or distant cultural echoes of encounters with other humans, filtered through millennia of retelling? We cannot say, but the resonance is uncanny. To think of these companions is to confront our own fragility. We walk the earth as if it were always ours, as if our dominance were inevitable. But for most of history, we shared it, and sharing means uncertainty. If Neanderthals had survived, if Denisovans had endured, how different would our story be? Would there be multiple civilizations rising side by side, shaped by different forms of humanity? Would we recognize each other as equals, or divide ourselves along lines of anatomy as we do along lines of culture? The thought experiment is haunting because it reminds us that our supremacy is an accident of history, not a birthright. Even now, in our DNA, the companions whisper. A Neanderthal gene variant predisposes some of us to stronger immune responses. A Denisovan inheritance grants resilience in high mountains. Other fragments are less kind, linked to disease or depression. We carry them not as relics, but as living parts of ourselves, proof that species boundaries are not absolute. Humanity is porous, hybrid, tangled. To imagine ourselves as solitary is to deny the evidence written in our cells. Archaeologists search caves and seabeds for more traces, hoping to flesh out the lives of those companions. But perhaps the greatest preservation lies not in fossils, but in us, in our memories, our myths, our very bodies. Every time we stare into the fire and tell stories, we are continuing a practice older than our species, one we may have learned beside Neanderthals or Denisovans. Every time we carve, paint, or sing, we echo their creativity, even if their voices are silent. We are haunted not by their absence, but by the recognition that we are not alone, that we never were. In the silence of a cave where a Neanderthal once left a handprint, in the darkness of a mountain where Denisovans once sang, in the jungle where Homo floresiensis once moved like shadows, the earth still remembers. The echoes are faint, but they persist. To listen for them is to acknowledge that humanity is not a singular triumph, but a chorus diminished by time. We are the last singers, carrying harmonies that belonged to others, harmonies we scarcely recognize. And so, when we speak of the forgotten companions, we are not merely cataloging extinct species. We are mourning siblings whose faces we cannot reconstruct, whose songs we cannot recover. We are acknowledging that the human story is incomplete, that whole chapters have been torn from the book and scattered by wind and water. Yet their traces live on in us, not only in our blood, but in our sense of mystery, our intuition that the world once held others who were like us, but not us. The forgotten companions are not truly forgotten. They live in our genomes, in our folklore, in the ruins of caves, and in the haunting awareness that our own fate may one day mirror theirs. If the earth has erased them, it may one day erase us. And perhaps, in some future age, another species will walk the earth and wonder whether they once had companions too, now vanished into silence. For now, we carry their memory. Every breath, every story, every spark of fire is also theirs. To remember them is to remember that humanity was never meant to be singular. We are not alone. We are the sum of forgotten voices, and they still whisper in the marrow of our bones. There are silences in history that feel heavier than words, voids so deep that they invite imagination to spill across them. The earth has kept many secrets, burying them beneath oceans, erasing them with glaciers, consuming them in forests and deserts. Yet none is more haunting than the possibility that humanity's story is not the clean ascent we imagine, but a broken path, one where civilizations rose and fell before the record began, leaving behind only whispers. These are the builders beyond memory, not mythic in the sense of gods, nor scientific in the sense of names and dates, but entities who haunt the threshold between archaeology and speculation. We cannot prove they existed, but we cannot banish the thought that they might have. Every discovery of a ruin that should not exist reopens this question. Göbekli Tepe, raised 12,000 years ago by hunter-gatherers who should not yet have had the organization to carve and lift such stones. The underwater shapes at Yonaguni, too sharp for geology, too ambiguous for certainty. The drowned terraces in the Gulf of Kambat, perhaps natural, perhaps man-made. These anomalies sit at the edge of our narrative, like fragments of an erased chapter. Archaeology, cautious by necessity, offers restraint. These are early farmers, proto-cities, misread rock formations. But imagination lingers. What if they are glimpses of something older, a civilization erased by flood or fire, its traces scattered so thoroughly that only accidents of chance allow us to suspect it? The geological record is merciless. If a civilization had risen 10 or 20,000 years before Mesopotamia, what would remain? Most of their structures would have been wood, clay, or cloth, devoured by time. Even stone weathers, even metal corrodes. In 10,000 years, our own cities would crumble into little more than indistinct ruins, their outlines hard to read. In 50,000 years, most traces would be gone, drowned, buried, melted back into the earth. What would survive of us might be what survives of them: enigmatic alignments, scattered carvings, myths retold so many times that fact and story fuse until no separation is possible. The silence of evidence is not evidence of silence. Myth, then, becomes the archive of possibility. Legends of Atlantis, of golden ages lost in flood, of giants who built and fell, are not scientific records, but they carry the resonance of cultural memory. Why does nearly every culture speak of a time before time, when humans lived in harmony or excess, only to be destroyed? Why does water so often play the role of erasure and fire the role of punishment? Some argue these are archetypes, universal metaphors, yet others see in them the echoes of real resets, floods at the end of the Ice Age, volcanic winters, impacts from the sky that may have extinguished more than animals. If myths encode fragments of truth, then perhaps the builders beyond memory live within those fragments, glimpsed only through allegory. The stars, too, may hold traces of their presence. Ancient alignments suggest an obsession with the heavens, with tracking solstices and equinoxes, with inscribing cosmology into stone. Some of these alignments reach back to dates far older than the supposed age of the sites themselves, as if the builders were calibrating to skies they should not have seen. Did they inherit this knowledge from earlier watchers, now erased? Or is this coincidence the human mind seeking patterns? The question itself is a kind of mirror. We look into the sky, and the sky reflects back our own hunger to connect with those who came before, even if they are invisible. Science demands skepticism, and yet humility is part of science too. We cannot rule out what we have not yet discovered. The ocean floors are vast, and we have barely mapped them. Submerged plains like Doggerland, once teeming with human life, are only beginning to yield their secrets. What lies deeper, in trenches and shelves drowned for tens of millennia? If civilizations did rise before the Holocene, their cities would likely now be reefs, their streets silt, their temples drowned. To dismiss the possibility is to forget how incomplete our record is. The earth is an eraser, and erasers leave behind only ghosts. But perhaps the builders beyond memory do not dwell only in speculation. Perhaps they dwell within us. Our species carries genetic legacies from Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other lineages we are only beginning to name. Is it possible that cultural legacies too survive in hidden form? A carving tradition here, a myth motif there, fragments of knowledge passed like embers through dark ages until reignited. What if agriculture itself, the leap that defines civilization, was not invention, but reinvention, remembered dimly from a time before the flood? These are questions we cannot answer, but they press against us like the weight of the deep sea, insistent and unyielding. To imagine the builders beyond memory is not to abandon reason, but to expand awe. We are humbled when we stand among ruins already known. Pyramids, ziggurats, temples carved into mountainsides. To imagine what has been erased is to extend that humility into mystery, to accept that our story may be one of recurrence rather than ascent. Civilizations rise, they fall, they are forgotten, and perhaps they rise again. If this is true, then we are not the pinnacle, but the latest iteration. Heirs not only to remembered ancestors, but to forgotten ones. The possibility should not diminish us. It should deepen us, reminding us that we are participants in a cycle far older than our archives admit. And what of the future? If the Earth resets again, as it surely will, through climate, through impact, through the slow grind of time, what of us will remain? Perhaps little more than the builders beyond memory have left. Enigmatic structures, half-understood myths, alignments that suggest knowledge we cannot fully reconstruct. Perhaps one day, another species will walk the earth and wonder if there were civilizations before them, erased beyond proof. They may find fragments of our bones, rusted silhouettes of our machines, faint inscriptions in stone, and they too will imagine builders beyond memory. In that sense, we and they are linked, joined by the same hunger to remember what the earth insists on forgetting. As dusk gathers over the ruins of Göbekli Tepe, or as waves break over the drowned plains of Doggerland, one cannot help but feel that we are standing in the presence of absence. The builders beyond memory are not visible, yet their possibility is palpable. They are the silence behind the myths, the shadows behind the stars, the ghosts beneath the waves. Whether they truly lived or not, they inhabit our imagination, and in doing so, they remind us of the fragility of knowledge, the arrogance of certainty, and the wonder of mystery. So we end our journey here, at the threshold of the unknowable. The builders beyond memory may be fiction, or they may be fact erased. But in their ambiguity lies their power. They are the question that refuses to close, the echo that refuses to fade, the invitation to humility before the abyss of time. And if we listen closely enough, perhaps we will hear them, not in words, but in the silence of ruins, the rhythm of waves, the constellations traced across the night sky. They remind us that to be human is not only to remember, but to wonder what has been forgotten.